So you're in PLB 112 this quarter and you want to learn more about vernalization? Don't worry, we got you. What is vernalization? The word vernalization is derived from the Latin word vernus, which means of spring or spring-like. To introduce us to the topic, let's watch this short clip and see what we can observe. Key observations that we noticed during this clip were flowering and the change in seasons or weather. Now that we have that in mind, let's use these observations to help us define vernalization. Vernalization is the treatment of seeds, seedlings, bulbs, or other parts of a plant to cold conditions in order to shorten the vegetative period and promote flowering. Let's define the vegetative phase. This is the developmental stage between germination and the reproduction phase in a plant's life cycle. During this stage, plants focus on storing and accumulating resources and undergoing photosynthesis to prepare for reproduction and flowering. In addition to the vegetative phase, plants also have a reproductive phase. This is the developmental stage that occurs after the vegetative phase in a plant's life cycle. During this stage, plants focus on flowering, development of reproductive organs, and preparing to reproduce. Now let's talk about the types of vernalization. There are two main types. Let's start off with defining obligate vernalization. This type of vernalization is when cold exposure is necessary and required for flowering to occur. In addition, there's facultative vernalization. This is when cold exposure is beneficial for a plant, but it is not required for flowering to occur. Now let's watch some clips to solidify our knowledge on these two types of vernalization. To help us explain obligate vernalization, we have our little plant friend here, and typically plants that undergo obligate vernalization are biennial plants. A biennial plant is a flowering plant that completes its life cycle in 2 growing seasons. Here we see that when our plant friend is exposed to the cold, they flower, but when they're not exposed to the cold, they tend to stay vegetative. So let's see this in action. Here we have a cabbage seed and we're going to plant it. There it is in the ground, and here we're going to watch it grow. So we see it in its vegetative state, and we see it exposed to the cold. Then we see flowering occur. Let's see what happens when the seed is planted in a greenhouse and it's not exposed to the cold. There it is in its vegetative state, once again not exposed to the cold, and then we see it stay vegetative and there's no flowering occurring. Now that we're experts on obligate vernalization, let's move on to facultative vernalization. So when our plant friend is exposed to the cold, flowering occurs. When it's not exposed to the cold, late flowering occurs. So once again, cold exposure is not required for flowering, but it is beneficial for the plant. Here we have an Arabidopsis seed and we're going to plant it. We're going to watch it grow, and then it sprouts, and then we see it exposed to the cold. And then we see flowering occur. So what happens when we do this in a greenhouse? Let's see. It's growing and sprouting, and it's not exposed to the cold. And we see it grow more and more. And then we see it flower, but we notice that there's snow outside, so it's flowering late.
Why is vernalization important? Well, vernalization became an important practice in agriculture because it would ensure reliable production of crops, especially in regions that experienced frost or drought. Vernalization is also important because it increases crop yield. How does it do this? Vernalization ensures that 2 crops per season are produced on the same land, which will be a grain crop and a catch crop, which essentially increases the yield of produce and increases production of seeds from parents. Now let's talk about wheat. Wheat is a very staple crop that undergoes vernalization, and if it does not experience winter, it will most likely stay in a vegetative state and not reproduce grain. Also, anthropogenic climate changes can affect where wheat and other crops can be grown if the temperatures do not get low enough to activate vernalization. How does vernalization work? Let's talk about FLC and Arabidopsis thaliana. Arabidopsis thaliana is a small mustard plant which is often used as the model organism for the scientific studies. It's also commonly used to study the vernalization biochemical pathways. And finally, we'll talk about FLC, which is short for flowering locust C, which is primarily studied in Arabidopsis thaliana, and an essential part of the flowering and vernalization processes. So, what does FLC actually do? In plants that require vernalization to flower, FLC acts as a repressor of flowering. Before cold exposure, FLC is transcribed at high levels, keeping the plant in a vegetative state. Cold exposure promotes the transcription of VIN3, which inhibits FLC. FLC can no longer inhibit flowering genes like FT and SOC1, and flowering occurs. Here we have a video to demonstrate the function of FLC.
This is our FLC protein, and these are FT and SOC1 genes. They help promote flowering. One of FLC's roles is to inhibit the FT and SOC1 genes. When this happens, these genes can no longer promote flowering. However, FLC does not like it when the plant is exposed to the cold. On the other hand, VIN3, a protein involved in vernalization, likes the cold. In cold conditions, there's an abundant amount of VIN3 and it likes to bind to the FLC gene. Once VIN3 binds the FLC gene, it inhibits transcription and therefore decreases the production of the FLC protein. So as a quick summary, as temperature decreases, VIN3 increases, FL3 decreases, and then as a result, flowering increases. So let's go over the pathway real quick.
Let's talk a little bit more about the biochemical vernalization pathway. In the presence of cold exposure promotes VIN3. VIN3 inhibits FLC, and FLC can no longer inhibit floral integrator genes like FT and SOC1, and then we see flowering occur. What would a good lecture be without some practice problems? Question number 1. What would be the phenotype of a VIN3 recessive loss of function mutant? If you said cold insensitive non-flowering mutants, you are correct. Question number 2. What would be the phenotype of an FLC recessive loss of function mutant? If you said constitutive flowering, you are correct. Question number 3. What would be the phenotype of a VIN3 FLC double mutant? Remember, VIN3 and FLC are opposite signaling states, with FLC appearing downstream. With the FLC gene being epistatic, this double mutant would show constitutive flowering. Great job, guys, on those questions. Current research points to epigenetic histone modification as a driving force for vernalization. Unlike other pathways we have studied, vernalization and flowering times are a delayed process. The time spent under cold conditions affects the length of flowering repression, and plants use this epigenetic modification as a way to remember the time duration spent under cold. We found this new biochemical regulation process very interesting and want to learn more about it in the future.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to check out our references.